Now, before I start, I want to assure you I loved the show. I read one of the books. I even reacted to the first couple of episodes, which you can check out on my channel. So I'm not hating just because I love to be a hater this time, okay? It was just something that I noticed in my own first watch through of the show, and when it first came up, I just assumed that they would address it in more detail later in the show, but they never really did. I also want to plug this article before we get into it. It offered a lot of good insight into the racial implications in the show and how it kind of fails to explore or even really address the questions about identity that it poses. The article likens the race problem in Shadow and Bone to the race problem in Bridgerton, and I would agree. Khadija and Bo did a great video diving into the race issues in Bridgerton, which I'll also link below. One of the main issues is that the only characters that racism ever seemed to impact are the characters of color, and it seems to just never really affect the white characters in any of the settings. Like, they just live in a society that's evolved past seeing race or something, and that's just not realistic. Like, the racism doesn't come from nowhere. It's built on a system that privileges and values white people, white features, white skin over others. And then Bridgerton and Shadow and Bone are both Netflix shows that act as if the racism comes from nowhere and is something that the characters of color must overcome to achieve their greatness, and something that they alone must overcome. The white characters are never shown having to overcome their prejudices. They're never shown having to kind of address how they view people of color or how the systemic racism in their societies benefits them or privileges them over others. It's always seen as strictly a people of color problem. In the article mentioned earlier, author Elise Martin draws attention to a moment in the final episode of the show.
Your first words to me were, "What are you?" This is what I am.
Martin says of the moment, "It's a crowning moment of magical achievement and a refutation of the racist stereotypes imposed on her. Alina defiantly defines herself by her abilities, not, as everyone else has, by her appearance. It also made me realize that Alina is the only character whose arc is built around overcoming racism." Time and again in the show, the characters display overt racism toward Alina.
What's a shoe girl doing here?
I'm Ravkan, on the cartography team.
She's off shoe.
Is that an answer? Back of the line. Your friends, too. Come on!
In the first episode, Alina is called a rice eater.
Stay away from him.
Oh, what? You're gonna troll me, rice eater?
Which was definitely not in the books, so it seems like they created a special new slur just for the show because Jessie Mei Li is half Chinese, which feels uniquely racist. But even though I technically am a rice eater because I'm South Asian, this specific fictional slur felt kind of targeted specifically to East Asians. So I won't dig into it too much. Anyway, the lunch lady guy sends Alina to the back of the line for being Shu, and then understandably she's humiliated and leaves in tears. Mal comes and finds her later with some food, but the racist remark is never really addressed. Alina feels bad, Mal comforts her, and then they move on. Later, when Alina is in the palace after being discovered as the Sun Summoner and whisked away by the Darkling, the ladies in waiting that appear to make her presentable for the crown make some racist remarks toward her, with one of them telling the makeover tailor, Genya, to make Alina's eyes less Shu. The ladies are quickly dismissed, and Alina says, "Please don't make my eyes less Shu." Genya lets Alina know that she doesn't care what she is.
"I don't pick my staff. The Queen assigns them, mostly so she can spy on me.
Don't change my eyes.
I don't care that you're part Shu. I care that you look terrible."
I gotta tell you, this did make me cringe a bit. It reminds me of when a person of color brings up a very valid concern about racism, and the nearest white liberal is like, "Listen, I don't care if you're black, white, purple, green, blue. I view everyone as equals." Like, the sentiment is fine, but also very lacking for 2021. Colorblindness is not only not enough, it's also harmful in its own right. I saw a few people complaining about those bringing up the microaggressions that Alina faced in the show, saying that none of it is real racism and people should be focusing on addressing systemic oppression before tackling people saying Alina looks weird for being half Shu. But it's not like microaggressions come out of nowhere, and it's important to address how colorblindness contributes to harmful ideas about racism. The ideology of colorblindness relies on the narrative that individual good white people are enough to combat racism. This is reflected in the show with Genya's response about how she doesn't care that Alina is half Shu. It's meant to be a kind of a sigh of relief for Alina, and by extension for the audience, to come across one of the good ones. But we can't really begin to deconstruct systemic racism without directly confronting whiteness as a concept, and colorblindness actually plays a prominent role in keeping those systems in place. In the article, Colorblindness is Counterproductive, author Adia Harvey Wingfeld writes about the findings of multiple sociological studies of how white people got involved in anti-racist activism, stating, "In many of these studies, as whites came to understand themselves as members of a racial group which enjoyed unearned privileges and benefits, this compelled them to forge a different sense of white identity built on anti-racism rather than simply supporting the status quo. Moving away from the colorblind ideology that sociologists critique, the idea that it's admirable to profess not to see color, that it's problematic to see oneself as a member of a racial group, is, according to the research in this area, actually an important step to anti-racist activism." So basically, it's beneficial to do away with this colorblind thinking, especially if we want to live in an anti-racist society. And then even the individualist approach that I mentioned earlier, that individual good white people are enough to change the status quo, falls flat upon further inspection. In the same article, Martin says, "Ironically, this focus on individualism is itself a function of group position. Whites, by and large, enjoy the luxury of promoting the importance of the individual because they benefit from living in a racially stratified society where whiteness is normalized. In most social interactions, whites get to be seen as individuals. Racial minorities, by contrast, become aware from a young age that people will often judge them as members of their group and treat them in accordance with the usually negative stereotypes attached to that group."
Out here, when you're different, look different, everything's at risk of becoming a fight.
The topic of treating minorities as members of their respective groups with typically negative stereotypes attached to them is interesting and especially relevant to how the Shu Han are represented in Shadow and Bone. Alina faces racist treatment from Ravkins, coded as Eastern European, for being Shu. From the racist comments made by these characters, the stereotypes associated with the Shu are that they have different eye shapes that are not considered desirable by Ravkin standards, and that they eat rice. And that's about it. It makes sense for Alina to not know much about the culture since she grew up as an orphan surrounded by Ravkins. In fact, it's kind of a central part of her narrative, at least in the show. I didn't actually read the first trilogy of books, I only read Six of Crows, but it's a central part of her narrative that she doesn't know who she is or where she comes from. And that's fine as a jumping off point. You would then have the expectation that the narrative would build off of that unknown, vaguely negative idea about the Shu Han beyond being rice eaters, but you never really get any other ideas about the Shu Han. You don't even meet any other Shu people or mixed Shu people, which just seems unrealistic in wartime. Like refugees exist, people just crossing borders exists. Zoya, who is retconned to be half Suli in the third installment in the Grishaverse series of books, King of Scars, calls Alina a half-breed at the palace, which makes no sense because isn't she also a half-breed? And then I also think that this interaction was a missed opportunity for these two characters to have some sort of commiseration out of their shared experiences, but you know, I wasn't writing the show. Even in Ketterdam, where you'll meet people of Suli and Zemini descent, you don't come across any other Shu people who can elucidate the audience about who the Shu are, or anything beyond the fact that everyone in Ravka just seems to hate them. The reasoning for the hatred seems to be because they're at war, and you see a few Cold War era posters with racist caricatures of Shu people on them, but it's never really explored beyond that. The end, when Alina turns to the Darkling and says, "You asked what I am, this is what I am," should feel more triumphant and vindicating than it is. But given how hollow the representation of the Shu has been thus far, it just kind of feels empty. Alina has supposedly overcome her internalized feelings of self-doubt about being Shu, but that's only part of the struggle for people of color, isn't it? The world around her hasn't changed at all, and to paint a character of color's narrative arc as one of overcoming prejudice to achieve personal growth just doesn't work when the world around them hasn't changed at all. I know from reading the books that there are going to be more Shu characters introduced later on in the series. And, I'm not gonna say that there's not room to improve. I'll definitely be watching the second season, which, as of the time of me, recording this, they haven't actually confirmed that there's gonna be a season 2, but, come on, there's definitely gonna be a season 2. So, yeah, with the introduction of other Shu characters, I'm hoping that they can address and actually improve on this part. But I just wanted to point it out because it seems to be a recurring problem for some of these Netflix shows. And I also just think it was a missed opportunity because they took the time to cast such a great diverse cast of characters. And I just feel like they should have taken the opportunity to explore what the implications of these casting choices would have meant for the Grishaverse world. It just kind of seems like a half-hearted attempt most of the time. Like with Bridgerton, where they kind of it seemed like they were just going to be doing a colorblind casting, and they ended up kind of having this half-hearted attempt at trying to integrate ideas about race into the story without actually addressing the systemic origins of race and kind of exploring what that would mean in the context of the show and the Bridgerton society, Yeah, it just kind of feels like they kind of took a shortcut to try and be like, look, we're addressing race issues by calling our half Asian lead a slur. But, I'm just saying, do better. But yeah, so that's what I thought. Be sure to check out my other recap video about Shadow and Bone, where I react to the first 2 episodes, but only the parts with the crows in them. Love that. I don't know if I'll do another episode like that, just because, they take a long time to edit. So, we'll see how that goes. Be sure to like for engagement, and then also, tell me your thoughts in the comments, because I would love to see them. And, oh yeah, I officially had launched my merch the other day. I've been seeing I've been getting some orders in, which is so exciting. And it's understandable as well because the design is super cute, commissioned by my good friend Soup Heathen on Instagram. Go follow her. And yeah, it's also super discreet because nobody will know that you're walking around with YouTuber merch because most people just assume that it's just a funny and cute design. All right. Yeah. Thanks for watching.
Just think it's funny how bitches in they feelings now, 'cause I'm getting money and it's showing like they tummies out.